Inside the filing cabinets of Dr. Eliza Tanilius's pediatric psychiatric ward, you will find detailed records of childhood trauma. Case number 4 belongs to a boy named Nicholas, and it documents a highly unusual psychological reaction to an environment defined by chaos. Long before any physical disasters struck his home, Nicholas's childhood was shaped by a constant baseline of instability. He spent his early years navigating a house filled with adults using adult powders, engaging in illicit midnight transactions, and displaying erratic, criminalistic behavior. The adults around him routinely manufactured their own paranoia. They held late-night sessions with spirit boards and claimed to see glimmering mists or entities darting out of the corners of their eyes, reflecting light in ways that felt supernatural. Nicholas reacted to this constant tension by becoming hypervigilant. He spent his days highly anxious, hiding under windows and peering around corners, absorbing the adult terrors he was never meant to witness. His psyche was already primed by an environment filled with invisible, alleged threats. By the time a physical disaster actually arrived, his psychological defenses had already been stripped away. A residential kitchen floor plan shows the mechanics of the home's first physical failure. A sudden burst in the gas main pushed a highly pressurized bubble through the supply lines, traveling directly to the stove where Nicholas's mother was cooking. The instant combustion threw the mother backward, slamming her against the refrigerator. The violent blast burned away her eyebrows and top scalp hair. Dazed and trailing smoke, the mother managed to scream for the children to get out. The family scrambled through the panic, making it to a safe distance on the front lawn. With all the children accounted for and standing right beside their mother, a disembodied woman's voice began screaming from within the inferno. It repeatedly cried out, "My child is still inside." Neighbors and onlookers searched for the source of the plea, but they found nothing. The desperate screams were emanating strictly from inside the empty, burning house, fading only as the emergency responders took control. In the confusion, the adults gave the voice no conclusion. However, this auditory hallucination had quietly taken root in Nicholas's trauma profile, waiting for the next spark. Eventually, the kitchen was rebuilt and the gas lines were replaced. These physical repairs provided a false sense of safety, while the underlying psychological trauma went unaddressed. Over several hours, a silent leak filled the lower half of the rebuilt home with a heavy, odorless vapor, while the family sat in the living room, entirely unaware. The moment Nicholas's mother struck a lighter for a cigarette, the accumulated vapor detonated. Nicholas and his sister had to physically drag their dazed, confused mother from the house while grabbing the baby in her bassinet, making a frantic rush for the front door. As they spilled onto the lawn, a secondary explosion ripped through the structure. The windows shattered outward, turning glass into projectile shrapnel. The phantom voice returned, louder and more desperate than before. The screams of "my child" echoed from the empty, burning rooms, filling the air. This repetition pushed Nicholas to a total psychological breaking point. He dropped to the ground, tucked his head between his knees, and clamped his hands over his ears, a physical surrender to a catastrophic trauma loop. Back in the present day, sitting in Dr. Tanilius's office, the visceral memories give way to clinical analysis. A critical diagnostic detail emerges from Nicholas's account. The phantom screaming only faded from his mind the exact moment emergency services and paramedics arrived on the scene to take control. Today, recalling the memory of his injured mother triggers a contradictory emotional response. Nicholas admits that the image of her smoking head makes him simultaneously laugh and panic. This conflicting reaction serves as a clear marker of profound, unresolved post-traumatic stress disorder. It is the result of a mind struggling to process a memory that is both absurd and life-threatening. In Dr. Tanilius's view, the phantom voice was a severe psychological projection. In a home defined by adult powders and criminal activity, the stability of a protective parent was a rarity. This disembodied scream vocalized the desperate, missing sense of security that Nicholas's chaotic household failed to provide. The final takeaway is a stark reality. When a child endures repeated catastrophes in an environment already stripped of safety, the mind may engineer its own ghosts as a survival mechanism. Recovery for Nicholas involves addressing this internal trauma loop, a process that continues long after the physical structure of the house is restored.
Imagine standing on a front lawn and just watching your own house burn completely to the ground.
Yeah, that's a level of trauma that most of us can't even comprehend.
Right. And your brain will do almost anything to protect you from the sheer terror of that moment. I mean, it might temporarily shut off your hearing.
Or it might actually make you laugh hysterically while watching the flames, which is wild to think about.
Exactly. And if the psychological burden becomes truly desperate, your mind might even invent a ghost just to carry the weight of your terror.
Which is exactly what we're looking at today.
Welcome to this deep dive into the clinical case files of Dr. Eliza Tenilius. She's a psychologist operating within a pediatric psych ward, and well, today we are opening up case number 4.
Titled Nicholas and the Exploding House, an event that happened twice over.
Yeah, twice. So our mission for this deep dive is to establish the conceptual framework here. We're going to examine this terrifying account of what really sounds like a paranormal domestic disaster.
But we're looking at it strictly through the clinical lens of a psychologist treating severe childhood trauma.
Right, right.
We need to decode how a child's mind processes extreme, recurring physical danger
Yeah.
by basically blurring the rigid lines between harsh physical reality and the supernatural.
Okay, let's unpack this. Because reading through Nicholas's own account of his childhood, I mean, it genuinely reads like the script of a psychological thriller.
It really does. It's harrowing.
But before we even get to the actual explosions mentioned in the title, the case file demands that we look at the baseline ecosystem of his home.
Which is crucial. You absolutely cannot isolate the trauma of the physical disasters from the ambient psychological disaster he was already marinating in every single day.
Marinating is the perfect word. We are talking about an environment of pure, unadulterated chaos long before any physical fire ever broke out.
Right. The baseline sets the stage for everything that follows.
Yeah, the clinical notes describe Nicholas recounting his story, quote, without breath. You can actually feel the residual panic in his phrasing. He rapidly lists off all these behaviors of the adults in his house: constant drinking, chain smoking, playing with spirit boards.
Which is terrifying for a kid.
Absolutely. And dealing in what he calls midnight criminalistic activities and snorting adult powders.
So this is a kid who is permanently peering around corners, absorbing behaviors no child should ever have to process.
Exactly. And amidst all this illicit activity, he repeatedly mentions a shimmering mist.
Yes, the mist.
He describes it as a streak of white light that even the neighbors complained about. Something that, catches the corner of your eye, but when you turn to look, nothing is there.
Yeah.
Nicholas is left asking himself these deeply anxious questions like, what was it? Where did it go? Will it come back?
Yeah.
And most importantly, can it hurt me?
Well, we need to look at how storytelling itself serves as a vital coping mechanism for survivors of chronic neglect.
Okay, how so?
Nicholas is cataloging these chaotic, disjointed elements. The powders, the spirit boards, the mist, in this breathless rush, because he is desperately trying to regain a sense of narrative control.
Oh, that makes sense.
Right. When you grow up in an environment where you have zero physical or emotional agency, organizing the chaos into a sequential story is just a way of imposing order on madness.
I have to push back on the psychological interpretation of that mist for a second, though.
Okay, let's hear it.
My first instinct reading this wasn't that the mist was some grand manifestation of his internal stress. I mean, the adults are constantly smoking. They are snorting these adult powders.
Right.
They're doing who knows what in the middle of the night. Couldn't this shimmering mist literally just be chemical smoke in a poorly ventilated house? Why do we immediately jump to a psychological manifestation?
That's a fair point. It is entirely possible there were physical, airborne particulates in that house. However,
But clinically, it means something else.
exactly. From a clinical standpoint, we have to look at the fear attached to the visual and the persistence of it.
Ah, okay.
When a child is raised in a highly unpredictable, dangerous environment, their nervous system is perpetually flooded with cortisol and adrenaline.
So they're just always on edge.
They're locked in a state of hyperarousal. They're constantly scanning their surroundings for the next threat. And this biological flood can actually cause the optic nerve to become overstimulated.
Wait, really? The physical nerve?
Yes. The brain is so desperate to identify a threat it inherently knows is present that it begins to misinterpret benign visual data, like a shadow or, as you said, a wisp of cigarette smoke, as an active, looming danger.
Wow.
The mist basically becomes a visual avatar for his generalized anxiety.
That feels like a like a faulty emotional smoke detector.
That is a great way to put it.
Think about how that operates in everyday life. If you've had a completely exhausting, stressful week at work, your baseline is fried.
Everything sets you off.
Right. A tiny inconvenience, like dropping your keys, suddenly feels like a catastrophic crisis because your alarm is already blaring.
Exactly.
For Nicholas, surrounded by unpredictable adult behavior, his brain is stuck sounding a 5-alarm fire 24/7. The smoke detector never shuts off.
Which makes his mind incredibly susceptible to seeing these shimmering threats in the shadows.
Yeah, his brain is screaming, something is wrong, find the danger, even if it has to assign that danger to a trick of the light.
And the baseline arousal is so elevating that his threshold for perceiving danger is functionally zero. His nervous system is already operating at maximum capacity.
Which makes the transition from ambient, creeping danger to sudden catastrophic trauma incredibly destructive.
It does. It completely overwhelms the system.
Which brings us to the first actual physical catastrophe, the first house fire.
Right.
The physical reality of Nicholas's life suddenly catches up to the internal alarm bells ringing in his head. The case file details 2 burst gas mains.
And the house instantly combusts from the inside out.
Yeah. The violence of that moment, it completely obliterates whatever fragile, microscopic illusion of safety might have still existed in that home.
Absolutely shattered.
The specific sensory details he retains are staggering. His mother is standing at the stove cooking, and she takes the blast directly to the face.
It's just horrific.
The explosion burns off her eyebrows and the top of her scalp hair. The sheer force throws her backward against the refrigerator, and she lands on her butt.
Yeah.
Nicholas vividly describes the sight of her head literally smoking as she turns to the kids and screams, "Get out!"
Such a visceral image.
But reading the file, the detail that absolutely threw me was his reaction. Nicholas notes that recalling this specific memory, seeing his mother with a smoking head, still makes him, quote, laugh and then panic.
Right, the incongruity of it.
Laughing, that seems completely incongruous. If I see a family member caught in a blast, my brain goes to sheer terror, not comedy. So what does this all mean? It feels like his mind just snapped in half.
Well, we are looking at a textbook example of severe dissociation as a survival mechanism. Okay. Think of the human brain as having a complex electrical panel. When sensory input is too horrific, too overwhelmingly terrifying for the conscious mind to process.
Like watching your own mother engulfed in a fireball.
Precisely. When that happens, the brain's primary circuit breaker trips. It purposefully shuts down the emotional processing center to prevent a total psychological collapse.
So the laughter isn't humor, it's an error message.
Exactly. It is an involuntary release of extreme nervous tension, a phenomenon known as emotional incongruity.
Wow.
The brain simply cannot process the profound grief, helplessness, and visceral terror of watching a parent burn. So it temporarily substitutes a wildly inappropriate emotional response to put a massive wall of distance between the psyche and the pain.
It almost sounds like he's framing the trauma like a Saturday morning cartoon.
Yes, the cartoon logic.
The bomb goes off, the character's face is covered in black soot, their hair is smoking, they blink twice, and we laugh. It's completely absurd.
But effective.
Right. Children seem to naturally rely on that surreal, cartoonish framing to build a fortress between themselves and the very real, visceral possibility of death. The cartoon logic protects him from the smell and the reality of burning flesh.
The cartoon framing is a highly effective dissociative shield. It allows him to recount the event to Dr. Tennelius without being completely psychologically destroyed by it in the retelling.
But the shield is imperfect.
Exactly. As you noted from the file, the shield is flawed. That's why the laughter is instantly followed by panic.
Ah, because the reality seeps in.
The conscious mind momentarily catches up with the grim reality of the memory. The circuit breaker violently resets, and the unadulterated terror floods back in.
Ah, that's heavy. So the family manages to scramble out of the house. They escape the immediate physical danger of the flames. They are standing on the front lawn watching their home burn.
And this is the exact moment where the trauma morphs.
Yeah, it shifts from a domestic disaster into a full-blown auditory haunting. The paranormal doorway swings wide open.
Well, the immediate physical threat is somewhat mitigated because they are outdoors, but that massive surge of psychological terror still requires an outlet. The energy has to go somewhere.
And it does. Once they are safely on the grass, a woman's voice begins screaming, "My child is still inside. My child."
Just chilling.
Nicholas looks around. He checks the gathered neighbors. He looks directly at his mother. Everyone is accounted for. All the kids are standing right there.
Right.
But no one's lips are moving. The voice is unmistakably emanating from inside the burning house.
A neighbor actually rushes into the structure with a garden hose, braving the intense heat, but finds absolutely no one.
The house is completely empty.
Empty. Yet the screaming continues, echoing from the flames until it finally dissipates as the emergency responders arrive and take control of the scene.
I struggled with how to view this through our psychological lens. I mean, is it possible that a group of people experiencing a massive shared spike in adrenaline and communal panic could experience a collective auditory hallucination?
It's a valid hypothesis.
The fear that a child could be trapped is so potent that maybe the human brain synthesizes the auditory input to match the internal terror of the crowd. Or, wait, is the brain creating a ghost specifically for Nicholas?
What's fascinating here is evaluating the symbolic nature of the hallucination.
Okay, tell me more.
Let's look at whose voice is really screaming from a purely clinical standpoint. Nicholas has grown up in a chaotic, deeply neglectful environment. He has been exposed to illicit adult dangers his entire life.
Yeah, the baseline we talked about.
Right. So if we view this incident through the lens of Nicholas's specific compounded trauma, that disembodied voice screaming, my child from inside the inferno, is likely the projection of his own internal, deeply neglected child.
Oh, wow.
It is his own psyche screaming for the rescue and maternal protection he never received in that chaotic domestic life.
Is it genuinely possible that the human brain, when it is so completely overloaded by a life or death scenario, when the physical body has escaped but the emotional body is still trapped in the fire, actually creates a ghost to embody the terror it cannot process?
Yes.
It's as if the brain says, this level of fear is too massive to exist inside my body. It must belong to someone else. It must be a ghost in the fire.
Externalizing the terror is a brilliant, albeit harrowing, defense mechanism.
It's incredible.
If the mind projects the trauma outward into the environment, assigning it to a disembodied voice or a spirit, then the terror is no longer housed inside of the self.
Because holding on to it would just break him.
Exactly. Housing that level of concentrated fear internally would shatter the ego completely. The brain manufactures a haunting to maintain its own structural integrity.
That gives me absolute chills. And just as this horrific trauma begins to fade into a memory, just as the family attempts to rebuild and move on, the ultimate nightmare happens.
The second fire.
The cruelty of repetition.
Yeah.
The exact same disaster strikes again, totally shattering any illusion that they are finally safe.
The second fire is the critical turning point in understanding his long-term clinical prognosis.
I can imagine. Surviving a single traumatic event of that magnitude is devastating. But a repeated traumatic event, especially one that mimics the precise mechanics of the first, fundamentally rewires the brain's threat assessment architecture.
Let's trace the sequence of events because the sensory details Nicholas provides are incredibly vivid and specific. The kitchen is rebuilt, new gas lines are installed.
But unbeknownst to the family, those new lines bubble and burst again.
Right. They create a silent, odorless leak that fills the house for hours. The mother sits down in the lounge, sparks a cigarette, and, as Nicholas bluntly puts it in the file, blammo.
The sensory encoding during this second explosion is what permanently traps him in a cycle of anxiety.
The way he describes the fire itself is almost hypnotic. He watches the flame creep around his mother's head in a halo, and then it rolls across the floor like a blanket into the kitchen, causing instant combustion. Nicholas and his sibling grab his baby sister in her bassinet, and they drag their dazed mother out to the lawn for a second time. And then, boom! The windows shatter outward, spraying projectile glass like shrapnel as the house is swallowed by flames.
The details are just seared into his mind.
Here's where it gets really interesting to me. He describes the fire rolling like a blanket. It's almost beautiful.
It is.
It feels like watching a horror movie sequel where the monster attacks you in the exact place you thought was finally secure, but the director films the attack in this terrifying, poetic slow motion.
That slow motion encoding you were picking up on is a documented neurological phenomenon called tachypsychia.
Tachypsychia, okay.
It radically alters an individual's perception of time during a high-stress, life-threatening event.
So time literally feels like it's slowing down.
Exactly. When the amygdala detects a lethal threat, it floods the system with adrenaline, and the brain starts recording sensory data at an incredibly high frame rate.
Oh, to gather more information.
Yes. It gathers as much microscopic visual information as possible to calculate an escape route and ensure survival. That is why his memory of the halo and the fire rolling like a blanket feels so cinematic.
Yeah, it makes perfect sense.
These aren't just regular memories. They are highly detailed, hyper-focused threat assessments seared deeply into his neural pathways.
So these highly specific sensory triggers become permanent warning signs. The silent, odorless leak teaches his brain that you absolutely cannot trust your own senses. Danger is completely invisible.
Right.
And the shattering glass and the halo of fire reinforce the idea that mundane, everyday objects, a stove, a cigarette, a living room window, are inherently lethal.
When a trauma repeats with such precision, it cements a state of permanent hypervigilance.
Because it proved the fear was justified.
Exactly. The child's developing brain learns an agonizing fundamental lesson. Safety is a complete illusion. The monster didn't just come back from the dead. The repetition proved that the monster never actually left.
Wow. And right on cue, as the physical destruction of the second fire reaches its absolute peak, the paranormal element returns.
Yes, the auditory haunting comes back.
And it forces Nicholas into a corner where he has to find a physical way to cope with an invisible threat.
As the house burns for the second time, the disembodied lady's voice materializes out of thin air once again.
And it is screaming far louder than before, "My child, my child."
Which is just heartbreaking.
Nicholas notes that the screaming becomes so unbearably loud that he physically drops down onto the front lawn. He covers his ears tightly with his hands, and he puts his head firmly between his knees, curling into a tight fetal position.
Right.
He stays locked in that exact pose on the grass until the fire brigade and the ambulance finally arrive. Only then, only when the sirens wail and the professionals pull up, does the screaming finally fade away.
If we connect this specific physical reaction to the bigger picture of childhood psychological development, we are observing the ultimate act of physical dissociation and profound self-soothing.
Making himself as small as possible.
Yes. Nicholas is attempting to build an impenetrable physical fortress, using his own body, head between knees, hands clamped over ears, to block out an auditory hallucination that is essentially being generated by his own traumatized brain.
Wow.
He is desperately trying to manually shut off his internal alarm system.
It's just devastating to visualize. He's trying to physically deafen himself to his own mind's manifestation of panic.
Yeah.
And what stands out to me so clearly is the off switch. I keep marveling at this one specific detail in the file. Was that screaming woman truly a ghost trapped in the architecture? Or was she an auditory manifestation of his unbearable stress?
The clinical evidence points to the latter.
Because the voice only shuts off when the authoritative symbols of physical safety finally arrive on the scene. The paramedics, the fire trucks,
Right.
the adults who actually wear uniforms and protect people, in stark contrast to the chaotic adults he grew up with. Once actual, verifiable safety is present, the ghost stops screaming.
And that realization is the crux of Dr. Tenelius's clinical evaluation. The ghost is intrinsically linked to Nicholas's perception of safety.
That's fascinating.
The precise moment professional, competent help arrives, the moment external safety is definitively established in reality, the internal psychological necessity for the alarm ceases.
Because he doesn't need to be the one on guard anymore.
Exactly. The brain no longer needs to project the terror outward into the night air because the threat is finally being managed by capable protectors. The haunting ends the moment the psychological need for it resolves.
It is a staggering way to look at how resilient and how incredibly creative the human brain is when it is pushed to the absolute brink of destruction.
The mind will construct whatever reality is necessary, even a haunted one, to survive the unsurvivable.
Which brings this entire deep dive right back to you listening to this right now. I mean, we may not have lived through a childhood surrounded by illicit adult chaos, and hopefully we haven't lived through 2 spontaneous house explosions.
Hopefully not.
But we all face high-stress environments. We all experience trauma, grief, and anxiety on some scale. What Nicholas's clinical file shows us is that our brains have these incredibly unique, sometimes bizarre, and deeply profound ways of protecting us from emotional overload.
We see these mechanisms every day. Whether it's through the dissociative shield of dark humor, finding yourself laughing at a funeral or during a crisis when you feel like you should be crying.
Right.
Or through hyper-focusing on the surreal, minute details of a tragedy to avoid looking at the whole picture.
Or even creating external monsters, conflicts, and ghosts to explain our internal panic. The brain does whatever it has to do to keep you moving forward. It will invent a shimmering mist in the hallway or a screaming voice in the flames just to make sure you survive the night.
It is a brilliant survival mechanism, perfectly disguised as a haunting.
So as we close out case number 4, I want to leave you with a lingering thought to mull over.
Okay.
If our minds are powerful enough to conjure the very real, visceral sounds of screaming ghosts just to help us survive unimaginable physical trauma, what other parts of our everyday reality, our daily conflicts, our deepest anxieties might just be our own brains, projecting shadows on the wall, trying to protect us from the fire?